The room was quiet enough to hear porcelain crack. Carter Blake didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply lifted the kettle and poured. Boiling water struck Ellie's shoulder in front of guests who had come dressed for polite conversation, not witness. No one moved fast enough. Not Ethan, not Rachel, not even Victor, who understood power when he saw it. Maybe next time, Carter said evenly, you'll remember your place. Ellie didn't scream. She looked at each face in the room one by one, as if memorizing them. What none of them knew was that the woman standing there, silent and burned, was the one person who could end Carter Blake's $10 billion deal with a single decision. If you believe silence doesn't mean weakness, and that some truths take time to surface, stay with this story. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read every comment. And if stories about quiet strength and real consequences matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. In public, the marriage between Ellie Carter and Carter Blake made sense. It was the kind of pairing people understood without asking too many questions. Carter Blake, a rising executive at Hawthorne and Price Capital, carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed in forward-motion growth charts, acquisitions, strategic dominance. He spoke in clean, decisive sentences. He wore ambition like it was tailored into his suits. Beside him, Ellie was quieter. Not invisible, never that, but easily dismissed. She spoke when spoken to. She listened more than she contributed. At corporate dinners, she smiled at the right intervals, asked polite questions, and rarely interrupted. To Carter's colleagues, she was what they expected a wife to be in that room, supportive, composed, and forgettable. It was a mistake they all made. Inside the house, the dynamics shifted in ways that never quite left marks anyone could point to immediately. Carter did not shout often. That would have been too obvious, too easy to define. Instead, he corrected, adjusted, reframed. If Ellie chose a restaurant, he would glance at the menu and say, "Next time, pick somewhere with better judgment." If she spoke during a conversation he considered important, he would let her finish, then restate her point more clearly, as if translating something inadequate into something usable. Over time, the pattern shaped the air. Ellie learned when silence was more efficient than resistance. Not because she agreed, not because she lacked language, but because she understood something Carter did not. Not every imbalance needed to be confronted in the moment to be understood later. She watched. She remembered. She kept things. Her phone held more than casual messages. Screenshots of conversations, voicemails Carter had forgotten he'd left after late nights at the office. Emails he forwarded absent-mindedly, assuming she wouldn't read past the first line. Even small things, timestamps, calendar overlaps, inconsistencies in tone, were quietly stored, categorized in a way that only she could navigate. It was not paranoia. It was structure. Carter never noticed. To him, Ellie existed in a simplified model. She was the constant in the background of his expanding life. Stable, predictable, unthreatening. He did not question her routines because he did not believe there was anything beneath them worth uncovering. That assumption had protected him for a while. What he could not see, what no one in his orbit could see, was that Ellie Carter was not the name that carried weight in the rooms that mattered. Not legally, not professionally. The name that did was Ellie Hart. It appeared on documents that never passed through Carter's hands, on filings reviewed by boards, by regulators, by legal teams who specialized in discretion. Ellie Hart did not attend public conferences. She did not give interviews. Her presence was constructed, carefully controlled visibility, strategic absence. There were reasons for that. Oraline Biotech, the company she led, did not operate in a space that rewarded noise. It moved through regulatory thresholds, proprietary research, and acquisition pathways where too much exposure could distort outcomes. Deals of a certain scale required insulation not just from competitors, but from variables that could not be predicted, including personal vulnerability. Years earlier, before Carter, before the version of her life that now existed in that house, Ellie had learned how quickly visibility could become liability. She had learned how easily a name could be leveraged, how relationships could be mapped, exploited, distorted. So she separated them. Ellie Hart built the company. Ellie Carter lived the life no one questioned. The overlap was minimal by design. Different email systems, different legal representation, different financial structures, even her daily patterns were calibrated to avoid collision. Meetings scheduled under layers of intermediaries, communications routed through counsel, decisions documented, archived, insulated. To the outside world, Ellie Hart was precise, distant, and highly effective. To Carter, Ellie Carter was manageable. That distinction had held, until it didn't. Carter's current obsession, the deal he spoke about even in his sleep, had begun as a rumor circulating through the firm months earlier. Auraline Biotech was exploring a merger. Not publicly, not formally, but enough signals had surfaced to draw interest. Hawthorne and Price moved quickly. They assembled a team, built projections, initiated contact through the appropriate channels. Carter positioned himself at the center of it, with a kind of quiet aggression that made senior partners take notice. He volunteered for late-night calls, restructured proposals, anticipated objections before they were raised. He understood the stakes. A $10 billion merger wasn't just a transaction. It was a statement. Whoever controlled it would redefine their standing in the firm and beyond it. Carter intended to be that person. At home, the deal became a constant undercurrent. He spoke about Auraline with a kind of measured respect. "They're disciplined," he said once, reviewing documents at the kitchen counter. "Whoever's running that company doesn't make careless decisions." Ellie stood across from him, rinsing a glass slowly. She didn't respond. Carter continued, unaware. "The CEO doesn't show up anywhere. Everything goes through legal. It's deliberate, smart." He looked up briefly. "You wouldn't understand the level they're operating at. It's different." Ellie dried her hands with a towel, folding it neatly before setting it aside. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think I would." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't agreement. It was simply the most efficient answer. Carter returned to his documents satisfied. In his mind, the world was still arranged correctly. At Hawthorne and Price, communication with Auraline flowed through structured channels. Their corporate counsel, Daniel Reeves, handled most of the legal interface. The COO, Maya Lawson, appeared in select meetings, always controlled, always precise. The CEO remained absent, strategically so. Carter found it frustrating at times. He preferred direct negotiation, reading people across a table, identifying weaknesses in real time. But Auraline didn't offer that. It offered layers, process, distance. He adapted. He told himself that when the deal reached its final stage, the CEO would have to appear. That was when it would matter most. That was when influence could be asserted, when final leverage could be applied. He imagined that moment often. He imagined walking into that room, presenting the terms, closing the gap between valuation and agreement with a kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. He imagined being recognized. What he did not imagine, what he could not imagine, was that the person who would eventually sit across from him in that room had already watched him for years. Not as a competitor, not as a negotiator, but as a husband. Ellie moved through the house that evening with the same quiet efficiency she always had. Dinner plates cleared, surfaces wiped, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the spaces between movement. Carter spoke on the phone in the next room, his tone shifting into something sharper, more performative. Words like valuation, timing, and leverage carried through the doorway. Ellie paused, briefly listening, not to the content, to the pattern. She noted the way his voice tightened when challenged, the slight delay before he answered certain questions, the confidence that sometimes arrived half a second too late. Small things. But small things over time formed structure, and structure, once complete, didn't need interpretation. It spoke for itself. Ellie reached for her phone, opening a secure note she had been building for weeks. The timeline expanded by another entry time context observation. No judgment, No emotion, just record. In another part of the city, decisions were being drafted that would determine the future of a company worth billions. In this house, a different set of decisions was already in motion. Carter believed he was moving toward control. Ellie understood that control, once assumed without question, often revealed its weakest points only at the end. She closed the note. Setting the phone down gently, from the other room, Carter laughed, brief, confident, certain. He had no idea how much of his life had already been documented, or how soon those records would begin to matter. Carter Blake believed in proximity to power. Not the illusion of it, the curated version that lived in headlines and press releases, but the operational kind. The kind that moved through private calls, red-lined contracts, and late-night revisions that never made it into official summaries. He had spent years positioning himself just close enough to that center to feel its gravity without being consumed by it. The Oraline deal was the closest he had ever come. At Hawthorne and Price Capital, the conference rooms assigned to the merger team had gradually become insulated spaces. Access was limited, conversations lowered, documents marked with increasing layers of confidentiality. The firm understood what was at stake, even if only a handful of them understood how fragile the structure actually was. Carter sat at the head of one of those tables more often now. Not officially, not yet. But presence had its own language, and he spoke it fluently. He arrived earlier than most, left later than necessary, and filled the gaps in between with a consistency that partners began to rely on. "Walk us through the revised valuation," said Leonard Price, one of the firm's senior partners, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen too many deals collapse to be impressed easily. Carter nodded, sliding a set of documents forward. "We adjusted for their latest filings and projected pipeline. Conservative estimates still place Oraline above 9.5. 10 is achievable if we structure the incentives correctly." Leonard studied him for a moment longer than expected, and the CEO, he asked. Carter's expression didn't shift. "Still operating through counsel. Daniel Reeves is handling all legal communication. COO remains the visible executive." "Unusual," Leonard murmured. Deliberate, Carter replied. "They're controlling exposure." Across the table, Marissa Cole, head of due diligence, tapped her pen lightly against a folder, or avoiding it. Carter didn't take the bait. "They don't need visibility," he said. "Their numbers speak." It was the answer they expected. Clean, controlled, confident. What he did not say, what he could not articulate, even to himself, was that the absence of Oraline's CEO unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully explain. He preferred people. He preferred tells. A hesitation, a glance. The subtle recalibration that happened when pressure was applied at the right angle. Those were the things he trusted. Data could be shaped. Reports could be curated, but people revealed themselves. Oraline offered none of that. Just structure, just silence. That same morning, in a different building across the city, Ellie Hart sat at a long glass table reviewing a document that had already been revised 6 times. The room was quiet in a way that suggested control, not absence. To her right, Daniel Reeves adjusted his glasses, flipping through the legal addendum with precise movements. To her left, Maya Lawson leaned back slightly, arms crossed, observing without interruption. "They're pushing for accelerated integration," Maya said finally, "faster than their original timeline." Ellie didn't look up immediately. She finished reading the paragraph in front of her, marked a small note in the margin, and then set the document down. "They're under pressure," she said. Daniel glanced at her. From within, from themselves. It wasn't speculation. It was pattern recognition. Carter's language in the negotiation summaries had shifted subtly over the past few weeks. More urgency, slightly less precision, a willingness to close gaps that he had previously held firm against. He believed he was tightening control. In reality, he was revealing where control was thinning. Maya tilted her head. "You think they're overextending?" Ellie folded her hands on the table. "I think they're assuming we'll match their pace." "And we won't, no," Ellie said calmly. We won't. There was no need to elaborate. Aureline did not move faster because someone else was impatient. It moved when the structure supported movement no earlier, no later. Daniel closed the folder softly. There's another point, he said. Their lead Blake has been requesting more direct interaction. He's hinted at a final stage meeting. Ellie's gaze remained steady. Of course he has. It was predictable. Men like Carter believed that proximity to decision-makers translated into influence over decisions. That if they could just enter the room, sit across the table, establish presence, something would shift in their favor. Sometimes it did. Not this time. Not yet, Ellie said. Maya smiled faintly. He's going to push, I know. And when he does, Ellie's expression didn't change. We let him. Back at the office, Carter ended another call with more force than necessary, setting his phone down on the table with a controlled but unmistakable edge. They're stalling, he said. Marissa didn't look up from her laptop. They're being careful. It's the same thing at this stage. No, she replied, typing without pause. It isn't. Carter exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He couldn't afford visible frustration. Not here, not now. They'll come around, he said after a moment. They have to. It sounded like certainty. It felt like insistence. Leonard watched the exchange with quiet interest. Careful, Carter, he said. No one has to do anything in a deal like this. Carter met his gaze. They want the merger. Leonard leaned back slightly. Want and need are different things. Make sure you know which one applies to them and to you. The room settled into silence. Carter nodded once. Understood. But understanding in this case was selective. He understood the mechanics of the deal, the leverage points, the financial architecture that held it together. What he did not understand, what he had never needed to understand before, was that leverage did not always originate where it appeared to. That evening, the house was quieter than usual. Not tense, not yet, just still. Ellie moved through the kitchen with measured precision, preparing dinner in the same way she approached everything else, with attention to detail, with economy of movement, with an awareness of timing that rarely failed her. Carter entered midway through loosening his tie. They're dragging this out. He said not as a complaint, but as a statement he expected to be acknowledged. Ellie nodded slightly. They might have a reason. He glanced at her. They always have a reason, he said. The question is whether it's a good one. She didn't respond. Carter poured himself a drink, watching her for a moment longer than usual. You've been quiet, he said. It wasn't an accusation, not yet. Ellie placed a plate on the table, aligning it carefully. I'm listening. To what? She met his gaze briefly. To what matters. For a second, just a second, something in Carter's expression shifted. Not recognition, not suspicion, just a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Then it was gone. He dismissed it the same way he dismissed most things that didn't fit into his immediate framework of understanding. Right, he said, taking a sip. Well, this? He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the deal, the firm, his trajectory. This matters. Ellie inclined her head. I know. And she did, more than he ever would. Later that night, long after Carter had gone to sleep, Ellie sat alone in the dim light of the living room, her laptop open in front of her. The document on the screen wasn't part of Aureline's official files. It was separate, private, structured differently. A timeline. Entries aligned with dates cross-referenced with documents supported by attachments that had been collected quietly over months, years even. She scrolled slowly, reviewing. Not searching, confirming. Each piece fit where it was supposed to. Each detail reinforced the structure. From another room, the steady rhythm of Carter's breathing carried faintly through the hallway. Unaware, uninterrupted. Ellie closed the laptop gently. Across the city, decisions were still being drafted. Proposals revised. Strategies adjusted. Carter believed he was approaching the center of something significant. He believed that soon he would sit across from the person who held the final authority. What he didn't realize, what he had never once considered, was that he had already been sitting across from her for years. And she had been watching everything. The invitations had been sent 3 days in advance. Not formal, nothing embossed or ceremonious, but deliberate enough to suggest importance. Carter preferred gatherings that looked effortless while serving a purpose. A few colleagues, one investor, a controlled environment. It was easier to manage perception that way. Ellie knew this pattern. She had seen it in boardrooms under different names. That evening, the house was arranged with quiet precision. The lighting softened, glassware aligned. A table set for 6, not because 6 was necessary, but because it created balance. Enough presence to feel significant, not enough to lose control. By 7, the doorbell rang. Ethan Cole arrived first. Easy smile, practiced charm, the kind of man who knew how to move through professional spaces without leaving an imprint. He greeted Carter with familiarity, Ellie with politeness. "Ellie," he said, offering a nod. "It's been a while." She returned the gesture. "Ethan." Behind him, Rachel Dunn stepped in her attention, already scanning the room. She noticed details. People like Rachel always did. She hugged Carter lightly, then turned to Ellie with a measured warmth. "Your home is beautiful," Rachel said. "Thank you," Ellie replied. Last to arrive was Victor Lang, older, quieter, his presence carrying weight without effort. He didn't speak much, but when he did, rooms adjusted. "Carter," Victor said, shaking his hand. "Good to see you." They settled into the evening quickly. Conversation moved where Carter directed it toward the deal, toward projections, toward the kind of strategic optimism that sounded convincing in controlled doses. Wine was poured. Laughter appeared at the right intervals. Ellie moved through the space without drawing attention, refilling glasses, clearing plates, listening, always listening. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place. But Carter was off by a fraction. Not enough for anyone to name it, just enough to exist. His responses came a beat too fast. His confidence edged into insistence. The kind of shift that happened when pressure built beneath the surface and had nowhere structured to go. Victor noticed. He said nothing. Rachel noticed. She stored it. Ellie noticed. She understood it. Dinner progressed. Courses changed. The conversation narrowed, as it always did, until the room became less about food and more about positioning. "So what's their endgame?" Ethan asked, leaning back slightly. Orlean doesn't move without intent. Carter set his glass down with care. "They want scale," he said. "Expansion without dilution of control. We offer that." Victor tilted his head. "Do you?" Carter met his gaze. "We structure it correctly, yes." Rachel glanced between them. "And the CEO?" she asked. Still invisible, Carter allowed himself a small smile. "For now." "For now," Victor repeated. There was something in the way he said it, not doubt exactly, but distance from Carter's certainty. Ellie placed a dish on the table, her movements steady. "The CEO must trust the process," she said quietly. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even directed at anyone in particular. Just a statement. Carter looked at her. The shift was immediate. Subtle, but immediate. "This isn't really your area, Ellie," he said, his tone even almost gentle. The room stilled slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. Ellie didn't react. She adjusted the placement of a fork by a fraction of an inch. "I was only," she began. "I know," Carter interrupted. "You were only trying to help." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that closed conversations rather than opened them. Rachel looked down at her glass. Ethan cleared his throat softly. Victor said nothing. Ellie nodded once. Of course. The moment passed, or rather, it appeared to. Conversation resumed, though its rhythm had changed. Slightly more careful, slightly more aware. Carter spoke more now, filling space that hadn't needed filling before. The deal returned to center stage, numbers replacing nuance. Confidence replacing curiosity. Ellie continued to move through the room, collecting, observing, recording, not with devices, not yet, but with something more durable. Memory aligned with pattern, pattern aligned with structure. By the time dessert was served, the tension had condensed into something quieter, more concentrated. Carter stood near the counter preparing tea. It was a small act, ordinary, controlled. The kettle hissed softly. Steam rose. Behind him, Ethan was mid-sentence recounting a recent negotiation that had ended in his favor. Rachel listened, nodding at the right moments. Victor remained still, his attention less on the story than on the space around it. Ellie stepped closer to the counter. "Let me help," she said. Carter didn't turn immediately. "I've got it." "It's fine," she replied, reaching for a cup. Her hand brushed the edge of the tray. A slight shift. Nothing more, but it was enough. The cup tilted, not spilling, but close. Carter turned then. Too fast. The movement was sharp, uncalculated. And in that fraction of a second between reaction and control, something unfiltered surfaced. He lifted the kettle. No hesitation, no recalibration, just motion. The water struck before anyone fully understood what was happening. A sudden, violent heat. Porcelain shattered as the cup slipped from Ellie's hand. The sound echoed too loud, too final. For a moment, no one moved. Ellie's body stiffened, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough to contain the impact. The fabric of her sleeve darkened instantly, clinging where the water had soaked through. The air changed. Ethan froze. Rachel's hand lifted halfway, then stopped. Victor stood slowly. Carter exhaled. Not in shock, not in regret, in control. "You should pay attention," he said, his voice low, measured. "This isn't a place for carelessness." The words settled into the room with more weight than the action itself. Ellie didn't speak. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she looked at him. Not with anger, not with fear, with clarity. Then slowly, she turned her gaze outward. To Ethan, who looked away too quickly. To Rachel, who held her breath uncertain. To Victor, who met her eyes just long enough to acknowledge what had happened and what it meant. In that silence, something shifted. Not visibly, not immediately, but definitively. Ellie reached for a napkin, pressing it lightly against her arm. The movement was careful, precise, as if she were managing something far less significant than it was. "I'm fine," she said. No one believed her, but no one contradicted her. Carter set the kettle down. "Let's not overreact," he added. "It was an accident." The word lingered. Accident. It offered an exit, a narrative, a way to reframe what had just occurred into something acceptable, something forgettable. Ethan nodded too quickly. "Right," he said. "Yeah, just a slip." Rachel didn't speak. Victor remained standing. Ellie lowered the napkin. The redness beneath it was already forming sharp against her skin. She didn't hide it. She didn't display it. She simply let it exist. "I'll take care of it," she said. Her voice was steady, unchanged. She turned and walked toward the hallway, each step measured, controlled. Behind her, the room remained suspended. No one resumed conversation. No one reached for their glass. The structure Carter had built for the evening, the balance, the perception the control had fractured in a way that could not be fully repaired. Not by explanation, not by denial, not by silence. In the bathroom, Ellie closed the door gently. She turned on the faucet, letting cool water run over her skin. The sensation was immediate, sharp grounding. She watched the reflection in the mirror, not searching for emotion, not assessing damage, but confirming presence. Stillness, control. Outside, faint voices resumed lower, now uncertain. Inside, Ellie reached for her phone. Not impulsively, not urgently, deliberately. She opened the camera, captured the burn. One image, then another. Angles adjusted. Lighting accounted for. Documentation. She set the phone down. For a moment, she simply stood there, the sound of running water filling the space. Then she turned it off, dried her arm carefully, and looked at herself once more. There was no visible anger, no collapse, only a quiet recognition. Something had crossed a line that could not be redrawn. And somewhere beyond that house, beyond that moment, systems already existed that would recognize it for what it was. Ellie opened the door, stepped back into the hallway, and returned not to the room, not to the evening, but to the sequence that had already begun. The emergency room did not ask for explanations first. It asked for facts. Name, time of incident, nature of injury, location, contact information, insurance. Ellie answered each question without hesitation. Ellie Carter. Approximately 8:47 p.m. thermal burn. Right shoulder and upper arm. Her voice remained even unaffected by the quiet urgency around her. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency. A technician adjusted lighting. A doctor examined the injury with clinical focus, not curiosity. Second degree, the doctor said more to the chart than to her. We'll clean it, dress it, and monitor for complications. Ellie nodded once. No elaboration, no narrative. The system did not require emotion to function. It required accuracy, documentation, sequence. She complied. A nurse began irrigating the burn. The sensation was sharp, invasive, but Ellie's posture did not shift. She watched the process as if observing something external to herself. "Do you know how this happened?" the nurse asked, gently, not looking up from her work. Ellie's eyes remained on the steady stream of water. "Yes." There was a pause. "Would you like to share that with us?" Ellie considered the question, not for its content, but for its timing. "Boiling water," she said. The nurse nodded, writing it down. No further questions followed. Not yet. Across the room, a clipboard was updated. A digital record expanded, codes assigned, images taken. Each step added another layer to something that did not need interpretation to hold weight. Ellie understood that. She allowed it to happen. Carter did not come immediately. He called first. His name appeared on her phone while the doctor was applying a sterile dressing. Ellie glanced at the screen, then set it face down without answering. The call ended. A moment later, a message appeared. Carter Blake. "Where are you?" Then another. "You left without saying anything." And then, "This is getting out of hand, Ellie." She did not respond. Instead, she asked the nurse for copies of the discharge summary. "Of course," the nurse said. "We'll print everything before you leave." Ellie nodded. "Also the images," she added. The nurse paused briefly, then smiled with quiet understanding. "Yes, we can include those. No judgment, just process." By the time Carter arrived, Ellie was seated upright, her arm carefully wrapped, her posture unchanged. He entered with controlled urgency, fast enough to signal concern, measured enough to avoid drawing attention. "There you are," he said, lowering his voice as he approached. "I've been trying to reach you." Ellie looked at him. Not accusing, not welcoming, simply acknowledging. "They needed to treat the burn," she said. Carter exhaled, glancing briefly at the bandage. "It doesn't look that bad," he said. It was just..." He stopped himself, reframed. "An accident." The words settled between them again. Ellie did not challenge it. The doctor returned, then reviewing the chart. "She'll need to keep the area clean and monitored," he said. "Follow up in a few days. Watch for signs of infection." Carter nodded, stepping slightly forward. "Of course. We'll take care of it." The doctor's gaze shifted between them, brief, neutral assessing. Then he nodded once and moved on. No conclusions drawn aloud, but nothing dismissed. The drive home was quiet. Carter kept both hands on the wheel, his focus forward, his tone carefully calibrated. "You should have stayed," he said after a while. Walking out like that, it made things awkward. Ellie looked out the window. The burn needed attention. "I could have handled it," he replied. "We didn't need to involve." He gestured vaguely. All of this. All of this. Hospitals, records, witnesses, systems. Ellie turned her head slightly. "They asked questions," she said. Carter's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "And what did you tell them? The truth?" He didn't respond immediately. The car moved through a red light that had just turned green. Traffic continued around them. "Ellie," he said finally, his voice lower now, more controlled. "We need to be aligned on this." Aligned. Another word that offered structure without clarity. "It was an accident," he continued. "That's what happened. That's what it needs to remain." Ellie watched him. Not his face, his hands. The way his fingers pressed slightly harder against the wheel. The delay before each sentence. The recalibration in tone. "I understand," she said. It was the same tone she had used before. Efficient, non-committal. Carter relaxed slightly. He took her response as agreement. It wasn't. Back at the house, the remnants of the evening still lingered. Glasses half full, plates partially cleared. A napkin folded in a way that suggested interruption rather than completion. The space felt different now, not broken, but altered. Carter moved through it quickly, gathering items, restoring order where he could. "We'll keep this contained," he said almost to himself. "No need for it to go any further." Ellie stepped past him, placing her bag down gently. She didn't respond. In the kitchen, her phone rested where she had left it earlier. She picked it up, unlocked it, scrolled. The images were still there. Clear, precise, time-stamped. She opened a new folder, labeled it. No emotion in the name, just structure. Then she added the hospital documents as they arrived through the patient portal PDF. Files, digital confirmations, discharge instructions. Each piece placed where it belonged. Carter watched her from across the room. "You don't need to keep all that," he said. "It's unnecessary." Ellie didn't look up. "It helps me remember," she replied. "Remember what?" She paused just briefly. "Details." The word settled without emphasis. Carter exhaled. "You're overthinking this." Ellie closed the folder. "No," she said quietly. "I'm organizing it." Later that night, Carter sat in his office reviewing documents related to the Oraline deal. Numbers, projections, email threads, things he could control. His phone buzzed. A message from Ethan Cole. "Hey, just checking in. Everything okay?" Carter stared at the screen, typed, deleted, typed again. "Yeah, just a misunderstanding. Ellie's fine." A pause. Then, "We'll keep tonight quiet." Ethan responded almost immediately. "Of course." No questions, no follow-up. Carter set the phone down. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe the situation was contained. Manageable, resolved. In another room, Ellie sat at the edge of the bed, her laptop open once more. The timeline expanded. Entry date, timestamp, location, residence, incident, thermal burn, caused by Carter Blake. Witnesses, Ethan Cole, Rachel Dunn. Victor Lang evidence. Photographs attached, medical records attached, potential video unconfirmed. She added a final line. Verbal statement post-incident. It was an accident, no commentary, no interpretation, just record. She saved the file, encrypted it, backed it up to a secure location, then closed the laptop. The house had grown quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. This one carried weight, sequence, direction. Ellie lay back slowly, careful of her arm. Her eyes remained open for a while, fixed on the ceiling, not searching, not questioning. Simply aware. Across the hall, Carter slept, his breathing steady, uninterrupted. He believed the incident had been contained within the walls of the house, within the narrative he had already begun to construct. He did not understand, not yet, that the moment the hospital record had been created, the event had moved beyond him. Beyond explanation, beyond revision. It now existed in a system that did not forget. And Ellie had made sure of it. In the days that followed, Ellie did not change her routine in any way that Carter could easily recognize. And that was precisely the point. She woke at the same hour, prepared breakfast with the same measured movements, and moved through the house with the same quiet presence that had always allowed him to underestimate her. To Carter, consistency meant stability, and stability meant control. What he could not see was that beneath that surface, a second structure had fully emerged. One that did not depend on him, did not respond to him, and no longer adjusted itself around his expectations. Ellie's timeline was no longer a simple collection of observations. It had evolved into a system. She began by reconstructing the past with deliberate precision, not relying on memory alone, but verifying each recollection against something tangible. Bank statements were requested through secure channels, not from shared accounts that Carter could monitor, but from archived records linked to her independent financial identity. She cross-referenced dates with calendar entries, aligning transactions with events, conversations, and behavioral shifts. What had once seemed like isolated moments, an unusually large transfer, a vague explanation, a dismissive remark, now formed patterns that repeated with enough consistency to become meaningful. Control, Ellie understood, always left a trace. Carter's version of control had been subtle, almost refined in its execution. He rarely denied her access outright. Instead, he redirected, postponed, or reframed until the original question no longer seemed necessary. Over time, that approach had allowed him to shape the environment without appearing to dominate it. But systems built on quiet manipulation depended on one assumption: that no one was mapping them. Ellie was. She created categories within her records, each one serving a specific purpose. Financial discrepancies were separated from behavioral patterns. Communication logs were organized by tone, as much as by content, allowing her to identify shifts in Carter's language that correlated with pressure from work or exposure to risk. Even the smallest details, pauses in conversation, inconsistencies in explanation, changes in routine, were noted and aligned with larger developments. There was no emotion in the process, not because she felt nothing, but because emotion did not serve the structure she was building. What mattered was coherence, continuity, the ability to present a sequence of events that did not rely on interpretation to be understood. Her laptop, secured under multiple layers of encryption, became the central point of that system. Every file was duplicated and stored in separate locations, each one accessible only through credentials that Carter had no reason to suspect existed. She avoided using any shared network within the house, routing her work through independent connections that left no visible trace on their domestic infrastructure. At the same time, she initiated contact with someone Carter had never met. Laura Bennett did not advertise herself in the way many attorneys did. Her work circulated through referrals through clients who required discretion more than visibility. She specialized in cases where personal and corporate realities intersected, where legal strategy required an understanding of both emotional dynamics and financial complexity. Ellie reached out through a channel that bypassed conventional intake processes, using a contact provided years earlier under circumstances that had nothing to do with Carter. Within 24 hours, a response arrived. The first meeting was scheduled in an office that did not carry Laura's name on the door. Ellie arrived alone. Laura Bennett observed before she spoke, taking in the details that clients often assumed were invisible. Ellie's posture, her pace, the careful way she positioned her injured arm, all of it registered without comment. "You've already started," Laura said after reviewing the initial set of documents Ellie had provided. It was not a question. Ellie nodded. "I wanted the structure in place before involving anyone else." Laura turned a page, scanning the timeline with increasing focus. "This is thorough," she said. "More than most people bring in at this stage." Ellie remained still. "I didn't want to rely on memory." "You're not," Laura replied. "You're relying on evidence. That changes everything." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but intentional. Laura closed the folder. "What outcome are you preparing for?" she asked. Ellie considered the question carefully, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood the weight of stating it clearly. Legal separation, she said. Protection and containment. Laura's gaze sharpened slightly. Containment of what Ellie met her eyes. Him, she said, and anything connected to him that could escalate. Laura did not respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back, assessing not just the words, but the absence of hesitation behind them. "And your professional position?" she asked. Ellie's expression did not change. It remained separate. Laura studied her for another moment. "I'll need to understand the full scope of that separation," she said. "Because if there's any overlap, it will become relevant." "There is no overlap," Ellie replied. "Only proximity." Laura accepted that answer, though she understood it carried more complexity than it revealed. "Then we proceed carefully," she said. No sudden moves, no confrontation. We build the case until it stands on its own. Ellie nodded. That's what I've been doing. I can see that. Back at Hawthorne and Price, Carter's world was tightening in ways he had not yet fully recognized. The Oraline deal was entering a phase where precision mattered more than momentum, and that was not where he was most comfortable. He had built his progress on acceleration, on the ability to push through hesitation and create forward movement where others stalled. Now the structure resisted him. Requests for clarification were met with delays. Proposals were returned with revisions that seemed minor, but shifted the balance in ways that required recalibration. Communication remained formal, controlled, and distant. He interpreted this as strategy. He did not consider that it might also be evaluation. During one meeting, as he reviewed the latest feedback from Oraline's counsel, a detail caught his attention. A small inconsistency in the timing of a response. Something that did not align with the usual pattern. "Why the delay here?" he asked, tapping the document. Marissa glanced at it briefly. "They're reviewing internally," she said. "Nothing unusual." Carter frowned slightly. "It is unusual," he replied. "They don't miss timing like this." Leonard Price watched him from across the table. "Or they're choosing not to prioritize it," he said. Carter shook his head. "No," he said. "There's something else." The room fell quiet. For a moment, Carter felt the edges of something he could not define, a shift subtle but present in the structure he believed he understood. Then it passed. He dismissed it, because acknowledging it would require him to question more than just the deal. That evening, Ellie returned home later than usual. Carter noticed. "You've been out more," he said, his tone casual but edged with something else. "Appointments," Ellie replied. "What kind of appointments?" She set her bag down, her movements unhurried. "Personal." Carter watched her for a moment. "You should let me know," he said, "just so I'm aware." Ellie met his gaze briefly. "I'll keep that in mind." It was neither agreement nor refusal, just acknowledgement. Carter accepted it because it fit within the version of control he still believed he maintained. Ellie moved past him, entering the kitchen. On the counter, her phone lit up briefly, a notification from Laura Bennett, confirming the next meeting, along with a request for additional documentation. Ellie silenced it without reading it in front of him. Everything was already in motion. The timeline was no longer just a record of the past. It had become a map of what would happen next. And Carter, still convinced that the structure of his life remained intact, continued moving through it without realizing that its foundation had already shifted beyond his reach. Pressure did not arrive all at once in Carter Blake's world. It accumulated in increments so small that taken individually they could be dismissed. A delayed response, a revised clause, a question raised at a time when no question had been expected. None of it was enough to disrupt the structure he believed he controlled, but together they began to reshape it in ways he could not easily correct. At Hawthorne and Price, the Oraline deal had entered a phase where the margin for error narrowed with each passing day. What had once been a process driven by momentum now demanded restraint, and restraint was not Carter's instinct. He was accustomed to forward motion, to forcing clarity, or through pressure to creating outcomes by refusing to accept delay as a neutral state. Now delay was all he was given. The conference room that had once felt like a center of activity had become something more contained, almost observational. Fewer voices, more documents. Conversations that lingered longer than necessary, as if each word required verification before it could be accepted. Carter stood at the far end of the table, reviewing the latest set of revisions returned by Oraline's counsel. "They've adjusted the integration timeline again," he said, keeping his voice, even though the tension beneath it was visible to those who knew how to look. "This pushes us back another quarter." Marissa Cole leaned forward slightly, scanning the document. "They're protecting their internal structure," she said. "That's consistent with how they've approached everything so far." "It's excessive," Carter replied. "At this point, it's obstruction." Leonard Price did not look up immediately. He continued reading, turning a page with deliberate care before speaking. "Or it's discipline," he said. Carter held his position. Discipline doesn't require this level of resistance. Leonard finally raised his eyes. No, he said calmly. But uncertainty does. The word lingered. Uncertainty. Carter did not respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his attention back to the document, as if the answer might be contained somewhere within its margins. They agreed to the structure, he said after a moment. We're not introducing anything new. Marissa glanced at him. From our perspective, she said, we don't know what they're seeing internally. Carter's jaw tightened, though his expression remained composed. They're seeing the same numbers we are. Numbers don't eliminate risk, Leonard said quietly. They just quantify it. The room settled into silence again, the kind that did not require acknowledgement to be felt. Carter nodded once, as if accepting the point, though in reality he was recalibrating around it, searching for a way to reassert direction without appearing to resist the process itself. Fine, he said. We adjust. But we don't let them control the pace entirely. Leonard studied him for a moment longer. Make sure you're not confusing pace with control, he said. Across the city, in a building that did not carry the same outward visibility but held equal if not greater weight, Ellie Hart reviewed the same revisions from an entirely different perspective. She sat at the head of the table, though nothing in her posture suggested dominance. Her presence was quiet, contained, but it shaped the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. Maya Lawson spoke first. They're pushing back harder, she said, especially on integration speed. Ellie nodded slightly. They're feeling pressure, she replied. Daniel Reeves adjusted the document in front of him. From their side or internally, he asked. Both, Ellie said. She did not elaborate immediately. Instead, she traced a line across the page with her finger, following the structure of a clause that had been revised 3 times in the past week. They're accelerating where they shouldn't, she continued, and compensating by tightening everything else. Maya leaned back. You think their lead is driving that Ellie's gaze remained on the document? Yes. Daniel glanced up. Blake. It was not a question. Ellie did not confirm it verbally. She did not need to. The pattern was clear. Carter's language in the negotiation summaries had shifted again, subtly but enough to indicate strain. His proposals carried a tone of urgency that had not been present earlier, a willingness to close gaps quickly that suggested he was operating under constraints that were not fully visible to his team. He believed he was controlling the deal. In reality, he was revealing where his control was weakening. We maintain position, Ellie said. No acceleration? Maya nodded. He's going to push harder. I know. And if he forces a direct meeting, Ellie finally looked up. Then we let him try. At home, the rhythm between Carter and Ellie remained outwardly unchanged, but the space between them had shifted in ways that did not require confrontation to be understood. Carter had begun to notice small things. Not enough to form a conclusion, just enough to create a sense of misalignment. Ellie's movements were the same, but her timing had altered. She responded to questions with the same calm tone, but her answers carried less accommodation. She listened, but no longer adjusted herself to the direction of his conversation. It was subtle, but Carter felt it. That evening, he stood in the kitchen reviewing notes on his tablet while Ellie prepared dinner. They're stalling again, he said, not looking up. Ellie continued slicing vegetables with steady precision. They might be evaluating something, she replied. Carter glanced at her. Evaluating what? She set the knife down, aligning it carefully on the counter. Risk, she said. He let out a short breath. There's no new risk. Ellie met his gaze. Not from your perspective. The distinction was quiet, but it landed. Carter straightened slightly. What does that mean? Ellie held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. It means perspective matters, she said. Then she turned back to the counter, continuing her work as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Carter watched her. There was something in the way she spoke, not defiant, not confrontational, but fixed, as if her position existed independently of his response. He dismissed it, because acknowledging it would require him to reconsider the balance he believed defined their relationship. "You've been spending a lot of time thinking about things that don't concern you," he said finally. Ellie did not turn. "Everything concerns me," she replied. The statement was simple, but it carried a weight that did not align with the role Carter had assigned to her. He frowned slightly, though he did not pursue it further. Instead, he returned to his tablet, focusing on the numbers, the projections, the variables he could still quantify. Behind him, Ellie continued preparing dinner. Her movements remained steady, but her attention was elsewhere. Later that night, after Carter had gone to sleep, Ellie sat once again with her laptop reviewing the timeline she had built. New entries had been added, not just from their home, but from the deal itself. Through her position at Oraline, she had access to a layer of information Carter did not know existed. A view of the negotiation that extended beyond the documents he handled directly. She could see how his proposals were received, how his language was interpreted, where his pressure created resistance instead of progress. She added notes carefully aligning them with the existing structure. Entry behavioral shift in Carter Blake during negotiation phase. Increased urgency in proposal language. Reduced tolerance for delay. Correlation with internal pressure indicators. Each point was supported by documentation, emails, timestamps, meeting summaries. Nothing speculative, everything verifiable. She paused for a moment, considering the pattern as a whole. It was becoming clearer. Not just what Carter was doing, but why. Pressure did not only reveal weakness, it revealed direction. And Carter, without realizing it, was moving toward a point where those two would intersect. Ellie closed the laptop slowly. The house was quiet again. But unlike before, that quiet no longer belonged to Carter. It belonged to the structure she had built within it. And that structure was no longer passive. It was waiting. The first irregularity did not announce itself as a problem. It appeared as a number that did not belong where it had been placed. Ellie found it late in the evening, seated at her desk, with a kind of focus that reduced everything outside the screen to a distant abstraction. The house was quiet. Carter, already asleep, his presence contained to the rhythm of breathing behind a closed door. In that silence, numbers spoke more clearly than people ever did. A transfer. Moderate in size, large enough to matter, small enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. Origin, an account linked to a consulting intermediary, Hawthorne and Price, had used in previous transactions. Destination, a private entity with no direct connection to the Oraline deal on paper. Individually, it meant nothing. In sequence, it meant something else. Ellie did not react. She opened a secondary window, pulling up archived statements she'd already secured through her independent access channels. The process was methodical, almost quiet in its precision. She cross-referenced dates, tracing the movement not as a single event, but as part of a pattern that extended backward. There it was again, and again. Different amounts, different routing structures, same underlying shape. Money did not move like that without intention. Ellie leaned back slightly, not to rest, but to create space to see the pattern, without forcing it into premature conclusion. She adjusted the filters, narrowing the view, isolating transactions that shared structural similarities rather than superficial ones. A sequence emerged, not obvious, but consistent. Each transfer aligned with a point of pressure in the negotiation timeline. A delay, a revision, a moment where the deal could have shifted in either direction. Carter had not documented any of it, which meant either he believed it did not matter or he understood exactly how much it did. Ellie saved the records, exporting them into her secure archive. Each file was labeled with timestamps, cross-referenced against her existing timeline, and linked to corresponding events within the negotiation process. No conclusions, not yet, only alignment. The following morning, Ellie met with Laura Bennett again. This time, the folder she placed on the table carried more weight. Laura opened it without comment, scanning the contents with the same measured attention she had shown before. Her eyes moved quickly, but nothing was missed. "Where did you get these?" she asked after a moment. From accounts I have legal access to, Ellie replied. Laura nodded. And these entities? She continued tapping a page that listed the recipient of several transfers. Shell structures, Ellie said. Layered, not immediately traceable to individuals. Laura leaned back slightly. Not immediately, she repeated. There was a difference between impossible and inconvenient. Ellie understood that. Laura did too. These align with key negotiation points, Laura said, flipping to another page. That's not coincidence. No, Ellie agreed. Laura closed the folder, partially resting her hand on top of it. If this is what it appears to be, she said carefully, we're not just looking at personal misconduct. Ellie's gaze remained steady. I know. Laura studied her for a moment. You haven't acted on this yet. It wasn't a question. No, Ellie said. Why not? Ellie considered the answer not because it was unclear, but because it required precision. Because it's incomplete, she said. And incomplete information can be dismissed. Laura's expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but recognition. That's correct, she said. So you're waiting. I'm building. Laura nodded slowly. Then we continue, she said. But from this point forward, everything we do needs to account for escalation. Ellie did not ask what that meant. She already understood. At Hawthorne and Price, Carter was focused on something else entirely. The latest set of revisions from Moraline had arrived that morning, and they carried a tone he did not like. Not confrontational, not overtly resistant, but firm, more firm than before. They're locking down flexibility, he said, pacing slowly across the conference room. Every clause is tighter. Marissa glanced at the document. They're protecting themselves, she said. They're overcorrecting, Carter replied. Leonard Price remained seated, his attention fixed on a section of the agreement Carter had not yet addressed. Or they're responding to something we're not seeing, he said. Carter stopped. There's nothing new to respond to, he said. Leonard looked up. That's an assumption. It's a fact, Carter replied. The distinction mattered, but only if Carter was willing to examine it. He wasn't. Not yet. They don't tighten structure without cause. Leonard continued. Find the cause. Carter held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. I will. But even as he said it, his mind moved in a different direction. He did not question the foundation. He questioned the response, which meant he was already looking in the wrong place. That evening, the house carried a familiar stillness. Ellie entered quietly, setting her bag down with the same controlled movement she always used. Carter was already there, seated at the table, documents spread out in front of him. He looked up as she entered. You're late, he said. Meetings, Ellie replied. What kind of meetings? She removed her coat, placing it neatly over the back of a chair. Work-related. Carter watched her for a moment. You don't work, he said, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone stating what he believed to be an established truth. Ellie paused, just briefly. Then she turned to face him. I do, she said. The words were simple, but they did not align with the framework Carter had built. He frowned slightly. That's not what I meant, he said. I mean, you don't have a job that requires visibility, Ellie offered. Carter hesitated. Yes, he said. Exactly. Ellie nodded once. Some work doesn't, she said. Carter exhaled, dismissing the point with a small wave of his hand. Fine, he said. Just keep me informed. Ellie inclined her head. I'll consider that. Again, not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. Carter returned to his documents. Ellie moved past him, entering the kitchen. Her phone buzzed softly, a message from Laura confirming receipt of the financial records and outlining next steps for tracing the entities involved. Ellie read it once, then archived it. Everything remained contained. For now. Later that night, Ellie returned to her timeline. The financial records had been integrated into the existing structure, each transaction aligned with the corresponding event in both her personal and professional timelines. A pattern was no longer forming. It had formed. Now it needed context. She opened a new section, category financial irregularities, multiple transfers through intermediary accounts, alignment with negotiation pressure points, lack of disclosure in formal documentation, potential connection to influence channels. She paused, considering the final line. Then added, further tracing required no conclusions. Not yet. But the direction was clear. Money-like behavior followed intention. And intention, once mapped, rarely contradicted itself. Ellie closed the file. In another room, Carter slept unaware that a part of his professional life, carefully constructed, strategically managed, had begun to unravel in a space he did not even know existed. He believed the pressure he felt came from negotiation, from timing, from external resistance. He did not understand that the first crack had already appeared, and it had nothing to do with Aureline's hesitation. It had everything to do with him. The emails did not arrive all at once. They emerged gradually, threaded through systems designed to preserve record rather than reveal intent. Ellie did not search for them with urgency. She approached them the same way she had approached everything else, methodically, without assumption, allowing the structure to form before deciding what it meant. Access was not an obstacle. As Ellie Hart, she held authority over Aureline's internal communications, and through legal channels visibility into portions of the negotiation correspondence with Hawthorne and Price. What she did not have directly, she obtained through counsel requests framed within compliance review, phrased in language that did not signal suspicion, only diligence. Daniel Reeves understood the distinction. These came through as part of the last batch, he said during their next meeting, sliding a secured tablet across the table. Nothing flagged yet, but there are inconsistencies in tone. Ellie took the tablet, her expression unchanged. Inconsistencies, she repeated. Subtle, Daniel said, but present. Ellie began to read. The first email appeared ordinary enough. Carter outlining a revision to a proposal, his language controlled his tone, aligned with the expectations of a negotiation at that level. He referenced timelines, adjusted projections, acknowledged Aureline's prior concerns. Nothing unusual. The second email shifted slightly, not in content but in cadence. A sentence that pressed more than it suggested. A phrase that implied urgency rather than collaboration. It was not overt, but it was enough to create tension beneath the surface of the exchange. Ellie scrolled further. The pattern continued. Emails written late at night carried sharper edges. Responses to delays grew incrementally less patient. Where earlier communication had framed Aureline's caution as strategic, later messages treated it as obstruction. Pressure translated into language. Ellie set the tablet down briefly, not because she needed a pause, but because she recognized the pattern for what it was becoming. This isn't just tone, she said. Daniel nodded. No, he said, it's direction. Ellie picked the tablet up again, continuing. Then she reached the thread that mattered. It was not addressed to Aureline. It was internal. Carter to his team. Subject line. Alignment, keep this contained. Ellie read it once, then again. The language was different, less controlled, less aware of scrutiny. He referred to the deal as something that needed to be managed carefully from both sides, but the phrasing carried implication beyond strategy. He mentioned external sensitivities without defining them, and advised limiting documentation on certain adjustments until final stages. Ellie did not react. She continued reading. Another thread. This one older. Carter describing Aureline's leadership in a message to a colleague. Whoever's behind this company knows how to stay out of reach, he wrote. Smart, but it won't matter once we're in the room. Ellie paused at that sentence. Not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed something. He believed proximity would change the outcome. He believed presence created leverage. And he believed he would eventually stand across from someone he could influence. Ellie closed the tablet. He's anticipating a direct meeting, she said. Daniel nodded. Yes. And he's preparing for it. Yes. Ellie leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. He won't recognize the room when he enters it. Daniel did not respond. He didn't need to. At Hawthorne and Price, Carter reviewed his own emails differently. To him, they were tools, extensions of strategy. Each word placed to achieve movement, to shape perception, to maintain control over a process that increasingly resisted him. He did not consider how they would read outside that context. He did not consider how they would appear when aligned, when compared, when viewed as a sequence rather than as isolated exchanges. He believed in momentum, not in record. That afternoon, Marissa entered his office without knocking a document in her hand. "We need to talk about this," she said. Carter looked up. "What is it?" She placed the document on his desk. Oraline's latest response. He scanned it quickly. "They're asking for clarification on disclosure points we've already covered." Marissa crossed her arms. "From our perspective," she said. Carter's jaw tightened slightly. "They're repeating themselves." "No," she replied. "They're asking the same question in a different way." Carter looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means they're not satisfied with the answer." Carter leaned back in his chair. "We've given them everything they need." Marissa held his gaze. "Then why are they asking again?" The question lingered. Carter did not answer immediately, because the answer required a possibility he had not yet allowed himself to consider. "They're cautious," he said finally. Marissa shook her head. "They're precise," she corrected. There was a difference, and Carter was beginning to feel it. That evening, the tension followed him home. Not overtly, not in a way that demanded acknowledgement, but it was there in the way he set his briefcase down, a little harder than necessary in the way he moved through the house, without fully settling into it. Ellie noticed. She always did. "Something changed," she said quietly as she prepared dinner. Carter glanced at her. "They're pushing back," he said. "How repetition? Delays? Questions we've already answered?" Ellie nodded slightly. "They might be testing consistency." Carter frowned. "Consistency of what?" She turned to face him. "Of your answers." The room stilled just slightly. Carter studied her. "You're making it sound like they don't trust us." Ellie held his gaze. "Trust isn't assumed in deals like this," she said. "It's verified." Carter exhaled, dismissing the point. "They'll verify what they need to," he said, "and they'll move forward." Ellie did not argue. She returned to the counter, continuing her work. But the distinction had been made, and it remained. Later that night, Ellie integrated the emails into her timeline. Each thread was categorized, cross-referenced, aligned with the financial records she had already secured. The structure was no longer fragmented. It was cohesive. Category communication patterns, escalation in tone over time, increased urgency in later stage emails, internal references to limiting documentation, external messaging inconsistent with internal strategy. She added a final note. Anticipation of direct meeting as leverage point. Ellie paused, reading the entries as a whole. Then she opened a separate file. Not part of the timeline, not yet. A working document. One that would eventually become something else. A presentation. Not for emotion, not for argument, for clarity. She began outlining it. Sections, evidence. Sequence. No conclusions, just alignment. Each piece placed where it would be seen, understood, and most importantly, undeniable. Across the hall, Carter moved in his sleep, restless in a way he would not remember in the morning. His world was shifting, not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. He believed he was approaching the moment where everything would come together, where effort would translate into outcome, where proximity would grant him the influence he had been working toward. He did not understand that every word he had written, every decision he had made, every assumption he had built his strategy on, had already been recorded, and soon that they would no longer belong to him. The video surfaced without announcement. It did not arrive labeled as evidence, nor did it carry any indication of intent. It appeared the way most consequential things did, quietly through a channel that did not attract attention unless someone was already looking. Ellie was. The message came from Rachel Dunn. Not directly, not in a way that would suggest confrontation or alliance. It was forwarded through an intermediary email, stripped of personal tone, reduced to a single line. "You may want to keep this." No greeting, no explanation, just an attachment. Ellie opened it without hesitation. The file loaded slowly, not because of its size, but because she allowed herself the space to observe it without reaction. The frame stabilized. The room appeared familiar in its layout, distant in its tone. The dinner, the table, the positioning of each person aligned exactly with her memory, but memory, Ellie knew, could soften edges. Video did not. Ethan's voice was audible first mid-conversation, light, unguarded. Rachel shifted the angle slightly, the movement subtle but intentional. She had not been recording openly. The device had been held low, discreet, capturing the room without drawing attention to itself. Carter stood near the counter. Ellie moved toward him. The sequence unfolded exactly as it had happened. The slight misalignment of the cup, the shift in Carter's posture, the movement of the kettle. No hesitation, no interruption. The water struck. There was no distortion in the footage, no ambiguity in the action. It was not a blur, not an accident lost in motion. It was clear, contained, undeniable. The sound followed a fraction of a second later, the sharp crack of porcelain, the sudden intake of breath from someone off framed the silence that settled immediately after. Carter's voice entered the recording. "You should pay attention." Calm, measured, unquestioned. Ellie watched the frame pause, not because the video stopped, but because the room itself had stopped. Rachel's hand trembled slightly, the camera dipping for a moment before stabilizing again. Victor stood. Ethan said nothing. And Ellie did not move the way people expected someone to move in that moment. She did not step back. She did not react outwardly. She looked, first at Carter, then outward. The video captured that too. Not just the action, but the response to it. The absence of performance, the presence of awareness. Ellie closed the video. Not abruptly, not as a rejection, but as a completion. It was enough. Later that afternoon, she met Laura Bennett again. This time, the folder did not need explanation. Laura watched the video once, then again. She did not comment immediately. Instead, she set the tablet down, her expression shifting from analysis to something more precise recognition of threshold. "This changes the structure," she said. Ellie remained still. "How?" she asked. Laura folded her hands on the table. "Before we had documentation," she said. "Now we have confirmation." Ellie nodded slightly. Laura continued. "This removes ambiguity. It establishes intent through action and response." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "And it limits his ability to reframe the event as an accident." The word carried less weight now, less flexibility, less room for reinterpretation. Ellie did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the tablet, opening the video once more, not to rewatch it, but to review its metadata. Timestamp, source, continuity, everything aligned. "Will it hold?" she asked. Laura met her gaze. "Yes," she said, "as long as we maintain chain of custody and context." Ellie nodded. "That won't be a problem." Laura studied her for a moment. "You're not surprised?" she said. Ellie's expression did not change. "No," she replied, because she had not been waiting for proof. She had been waiting for clarity. At Oraline, the conversation shifted. Not publicly, not in a way that would disrupt operations, but internally among those who understood the weight of what was unfolding, the tone changed. Daniel Reeves reviewed the material with the same precision he applied to all legal considerations, but even he allowed a moment of pause after watching the video. "This introduces personal conduct risk at a level we can't ignore," he said. Maya Lawson leaned against the table, her expression sharper than usual. "He's the face of the deal on their side," she said. "That's not a small factor." Ellie sat at the head of the table, her posture unchanged. "It's a factor," she said, "not the decision." Daniel nodded. "But it informs the decision." "Yes," Ellie agreed. Maya crossed her arms. "So what's the move?" Ellie did not answer immediately. She allowed the question to settle, to exist without immediate resolution. "Then we proceed," she said. "But we adjust." "How?" Maya asked. Ellie's gaze remained steady. "We let the structure reveal what it needs to reveal." Daniel understood. "You're not introducing this yet," he said. "No." Maya frowned slightly. "Why wait?" Ellie looked at her. "Because timing determines impact," she said. "And impact determines outcome." Maya held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. She did not need further explanation. At Hawthorne and Price, Carter felt the shift before he could identify it. It wasn't in the documents, not directly. It was in the way responses arrived. Slightly slower, slightly more precise. As if each word had been measured against something he could not see. He sat at his desk, reviewing the latest communication from Aureline, reading the same paragraph for the third time, without finding anything he could definitively challenge. "They're tightening again," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Marissa stood in the doorway. "Or clarifying," she replied. Carter looked up. "This isn't clarification," he said. "It's containment." The word hung in the air. Marissa stepped into the room. Containment of what Carter didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, the question did not have an obvious direction. He leaned back slightly, his mind moving through possibilities he had not considered before. "There's something they're seeing," he said finally. Marissa watched him. "What kind of something?" Carter shook his head. "I don't know." And that was new. That night, the house felt different again. Not in structure, not in routine, but in awareness. Carter moved through it with a subtle tension he could not explain, his attention catching on details that had previously passed unnoticed. Ellie's phone placed screen down on the table. Her laptop closed but positioned precisely. The way she moved, not differently, but with a certainty that did not align with the version of her he had constructed. "You've been busy?" he said. Ellie looked up from where she stood. "Yes." "With what?" She considered the question briefly. "Organizing things," she said. Carter watched her. What kind of things? Ellie met his gaze. The kind that matter. The answer did not satisfy him, but it did not give him anything to challenge either. He nodded slowly. "Just make sure none of it interferes with what I'm working on," he said. Ellie inclined her head. "It won't," she replied. And it wouldn't, because what she was building did not interfere with his work. It redefined it. Later, alone again, Ellie added the final piece to her structure. Category: audio-visual evidence. Video recording of incident: Rachel Dunn. Clear sequence of action and response. Verbal statement captured post-incident. No visible attempt to de-escalate. She reviewed the document as a whole. Financial records, emails, video. Each element supported the others. No gaps, no contradictions. Only alignment. Ellie closed the file. The structure was complete. Now it only needed to be presented. The first official document did not arrive with raised voices or confrontation. It arrived with formality, with structure, and with the quiet authority of a system that did not need to announce itself in order to take effect. Carter Blake received it at his office just before noon. The envelope was unremarkable standard legal courier, no identifying marks beyond the firm name printed in small, precise font at the corner. It was handed to him by reception with the same casual efficiency as any other delivery placed on his desk, without urgency or explanation. He did not open it immediately. At that moment, he was reviewing a revised integration model, his attention fixed on numbers that refused to align the way he expected. The Aureline deal had reached a point where projections no longer behaved predictably, and that unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. Delays had multiplied. Questions had deepened. The structure, once responsive to his direction, now seemed to operate independently of it. The envelope remained in his peripheral vision. When he finally reached for it, the motion was almost absent-minded. He opened it cleanly, sliding the documents out with practiced efficiency. The first page carried a heading that shifted the entire context of his day. Petition for dissolution of marriage. For a moment, Carter did not move. Not because he did not understand what he was reading, because the meaning arrived all at once, without transition, without preparation. The words did not require interpretation. They required acceptance. He turned the page, request for protective order. The language that followed was structured, precise, and entirely impersonal. It did not describe emotion. It did not speculate on intent. It outlined events, referenced documentation, and established a sequence that did not invite contradiction. Carter read it twice. Then a third time. The details were unmistakable. Date, time, location, the incident, the witnesses, the medical documentation, each element placed exactly where it belonged. There was no exaggeration, no distortion, only alignment. His first response was not anger. It was calculation. He reached for his phone, dialing Ellie's number without hesitation. It rang, once, twice, then went to voicemail. He ended the call before the tone could complete. A message appeared immediately after. Ellie Carter, please direct all communication through counsel. Carter stared at the screen. The phrasing was deliberate. Not lawyer, not attorney, counsel. The word carried a different weight, formal, structured, final. He placed the phone down slowly. Around him, the office continued as if nothing had changed. Conversations moved through the hallway. Keyboards clicked, phones rang. The environment remained intact. Only his position within it had shifted. Across the city, Ellie sat in Laura Bennett's office, reviewing the same documents from a different perspective. There was no surprise in her expression, no hesitation. Everything that had been filed had already existed in her system, organized, verified, prepared. The legal process did not introduce anything new. It simply translated what she had built into a form that could operate independently of her. Laura adjusted a page slightly, aligning it with the others. This is clean, she said. There's no ambiguity in the language, and the supporting evidence is already in place. Ellie nodded. That was the intention. Laura looked up. He's going to respond, she said. Probably quickly, possibly aggressively. Ellie's posture remained unchanged. I expect that. Laura studied her for a moment. You don't want to engage directly. It was not a question. No, Ellie said. There's no benefit to it. Laura closed the folder. Then we maintain distance, she said. Everything goes through me. Every response is documented. No exceptions. Ellie agreed without hesitation. The structure was already familiar to her. In business, in negotiation, in any environment where stakes required clarity, distance was not avoidance. It was control. At Hawthorne and Price. Carter did not share the documents immediately. He read them again in his office, isolating himself from the rest of the team as he tried to understand how the situation had escalated to this point without his awareness. That was the part that unsettled him most. Not the filing itself, but the fact that it had happened without his participation. He had not been consulted. He had not been warned. The decision had been made, structured, and executed entirely outside of his control. He stood pacing slowly across the room, the document still in his hand. There were options. There were always options. He could respond, legally challenge the protective order, reframe the incident, argue context, intent, misinterpretation. He had done it before in business and negotiation, in situations where perception needed to be adjusted to align with outcome. But this was different. Because the structure she had built did not rely on perception. It relied on record, and record once established did not yield easily to reinterpretation. His phone buzzed again. A message from Marissa. We need you in the conference room. Aureline just sent another revision. Carter closed his eyes briefly. The two systems, personal and professional, had collided, and neither one would wait for the other. The meeting was already underway when Carter entered. Leonard Price looked up as he took his seat, noting the slight delay without comment. Marissa slid a document toward him. They've added new disclosure requirements, she said, more detailed than before. Carter scanned the page. "They're expanding scope," he said. "Yes," Leonard replied, "and tightening verification." Carter leaned back slightly, the weight of the morning still present in his posture. "This is excessive," he said. "They're asking for consistency," Marissa interrupted. "Across all reported data." Carter looked at her. "There is consistency. Then it shouldn't be a problem," she said. The logic was simple, but Carter felt the pressure behind it. He glanced at the document again, his attention catching on a section that referenced external financial activity language, broad enough to encompass more than the immediate scope of the deal, but precise enough to require full disclosure if invoked. His hand paused. Only for a moment. But Leonard noticed. "Something wrong?" he asked. Carter shook his head. "No," he said. "Just unexpected." Leonard studied him briefly, then returned to the document. "Expect more of that," he said. "They're not guessing anymore." The statement lingered. Not guessing anymore. Carter did not ask what that meant, because a part of him already understood. That evening, Carter did not go home immediately. He remained in his office long after the rest of the team had left, the documents from both worlds spread out in front of him. The petition, the protective order, the Oraline revisions. At first glance, they appeared unrelated. Separate systems, separate contexts. But the more he looked at them, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that they were connected not directly, not in a way he could define, but in timing, in escalation, in structure. Ellie had moved, and Oraline had shifted. The sequence was too precise to dismiss entirely. But the conclusion, that was something he still could not reach, not yet. At home, Ellie continued her work without interruption. The legal process had begun, but her structure did not change in response. It expanded. She updated the timeline. Entry legal filing initiated, protective order requested. All communication redirected through counsel system transition from private documentation to formal procedure. She reviewed it once, then saved. There was no sense of completion, only progression. Across the city, Carter sat alone, surrounded by documents he could no longer fully control. In another part of that same city, a boardroom prepared for a meeting that would define the outcome of a $10 billion decision. And Ellie remained exactly where she had been all along, at the center of both. By the time the meeting was scheduled, it no longer felt like a negotiation. It felt like a threshold. Carter Blake had spent the past 48 hours attempting to stabilize two systems that refused to remain separate. On one side, the legal documents had begun to move through channels he could not intercept each response from Ellie's counsel. Precise, contained, and resistant to any effort he made to reframe the situation. On the other side, Oraline's demands had shifted from structured negotiation to something closer to examination, with layers of disclosure that expanded each time he believed he had satisfied them. Individually, he could have managed either. Together, they created a pressure he could not redistribute. When the request for a final stage meeting arrived, it did not come as an invitation. It came as a condition. Oraline Biotech requires in-person executive-level alignment prior to proceeding. No alternative. No delay. Carter read the line twice, then forwarded it to Leonard Price with a brief note. "This is what we've been waiting for." Leonard responded within minutes, "or what we should have been preparing for." The distinction was not lost on Carter, though he chose not to engage with it. Instead, he focused on what he understood best: preparation through control. He reviewed every document, every projection, every communication thread that had passed between Hawthorne and Price and Oraline. He rehearsed responses to anticipated objections, mapped out leverage points, and constructed a narrative that positioned their proposal as not only viable, but necessary. If Oraline wanted a room, he would own it. The building that housed Oraline's executive offices did not announce itself loudly. It did not need to. Its presence was defined by restraint, clean lines, controlled access, and environment that suggested precision rather than display. Security protocols were seamless, integrated into the structure in a way that did not interrupt movement, but ensured that every movement was accounted for. Carter arrived early. He preferred it that way. It allowed him to observe the space before it filled, to understand its rhythm before he entered into it as a participant. The lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried intention rather than absence. Staff moved efficiently, their interactions minimal but purposeful. He checked in at reception. Carter, Blake, Hawthorne, and Price. The receptionist nodded, her tone professional. "Please have a seat. You'll be escorted shortly." Escorted. Another detail. Carter noted it, though he did not react. He sat, waited, reviewed his notes once more, though he already knew them. Time moved slowly, not because it lacked movement, but because it was being measured. Finally, a man approached mid-40s, composed, carrying the quiet authority of someone who did not need to introduce himself. "Mr. Blake," he said. "Daniel Reeves." Carter stood, extending his hand. "Good to finally meet in person." Daniel shook it briefly. "Likewise." There was no warmth in the exchange, no hostility either. Just structure. "This way," Daniel said. They moved through a series of corridors that reflected the same design philosophy as the lobby: controlled, precise, efficient. No unnecessary decoration, no visible excess. Every element served a purpose. Carter observed everything: the layout, the pacing, the absence of distraction. This was not a company that relied on impression. It relied on function. They stopped outside a set of double doors. Daniel turned slightly. "The board is already seated," he said. "We'll begin shortly." Carter nodded. "I'm ready." Daniel studied him for a brief moment, then opened the door. The room was larger than Carter expected, though not in a way that felt expansive. It was proportioned for clarity, not comfort. A long table extended through the center, surrounded by individuals who did not need introduction to one another. Maya Lawson sat to the left, her posture relaxed but attentive. Two board members Carter recognized from prior documentation occupied seats along the far side. Legal representatives were present, their materials already arranged. There was one seat left open, at the head of the table. Carter took his position on the opposite side, placing his materials down with controlled precision. "Thank you for having me," he said. Maya inclined her head slightly. "We appreciate you coming." The exchange was formal. "Expected," Carter began. He outlined the structure of the deal, the value it offered, the strategic alignment between Hawthorne and Price and Orlean. His delivery was measured, confident, calibrated to address concerns before they were raised. For a time, the room responded as it always had. Questions were asked. Answers were given. Clarifications requested. Adjustments noted. It was a system Carter understood, until the door opened again. The movement was quiet, but it altered the room immediately. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that redirected it. Carter turned. The woman who entered did not rush. She did not announce herself. She walked with the same measured pace Carter had seen every evening in his own home, controlled, deliberate, unhurried. Ellie. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing, not because it was impossible, but because it did not align with any structure he had built. She wore a dark suit tailored without excess, her posture unchanged, her expression composed in the same way it always had been: calm, observant, precise. No one in the room reacted with surprise. Not Maya, not Daniel, not the board, only Carter. Ellie took her seat at the head of the table, the last open seat, the one that had not needed explanation. Daniel spoke. "For the record," he said, his voice steady, "this meeting is now an executive session." He paused, then added, "Ellie Hart, Chief Executive Officer." The name settled into the room with absolute clarity. Ellie Hart. Not Ellie Carter. Not the woman who moved quietly through a house Carter believed he controlled, but the one whose authority defined everything in this room. Carter did not speak. He could not, because every piece of information he had dismissed, every assumption he had relied on, every structure he had built his understanding on, collapsed in a single moment of recognition. Ellie did not look at him immediately. She reviewed the documents in front of her, aligning them with the same precision she applied to everything else. Only when the room had fully settled did she lift her gaze. And when she did, she looked directly at him. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The same clarity she had held the night of the dinner. The same clarity she had carried through every step since. "Mr. Blake," she said. Her voice was unchanged, calm, measured, professional. "Thank you for coming." Carter opened his mouth. No words came, because there was nothing he could say that would restore the position he had lost. Ellie continued, "We'll proceed." And just like that, the room moved forward. But not on Carter's terms. Not anymore. The room did not erupt after the reveal. There was no visible shock, no murmurs, no sudden shift in posture from the people seated around the table, because for everyone except Carter Blake, nothing unexpected had occurred. The structure had simply clarified itself, and clarity in a room like this did not require reaction. It required continuation. Ellie Hart did not acknowledge the personal history that now existed between her and the man seated across from her. She did not reference the house, the dinner, or the moment that had redefined the trajectory of both their lives. Instead, she placed her hand lightly on the folder in front of her, opened it, and began to move through the documents with the same deliberate precision that had defined her approach from the beginning. "We will proceed with a structured review," she said, her tone even neither elevated nor softened by circumstance. "This is not negotiation at this stage. It is an evaluation." The distinction settled into the room with quiet authority. Carter remained still, his hands resting on the table in a position that suggested control but no longer carried it. He had prepared extensively for this meeting. But preparation relied on context, and the context had shifted beyond anything he had anticipated. Every argument he had constructed assumed a different opponent, a different dynamic, a different balance of knowledge. Now all of that had been removed. Ellie did not rush. She began with the elements Carter expected: the financial structure of the deal, the integration timeline, the projected outcomes. Her voice carried no urgency, no attempt to persuade, only the steady cadence of someone was presenting information that did not require reinforcement. For a brief moment, Carter allowed himself to believe that the meeting might still follow a recognizable pattern, that the reveal, however disorienting, might not alter the substance of what had been built. Then Ellie turned the page. "We will now address discrepancies," she said. The word was not emphasized. It did not need to be. Daniel Reeves adjusted a document slightly, sliding it toward the center of the table where it could be seen by all parties. The formatting was precise, the layout structured in a way that suggested internal review rather than external accusation. Ellie continued. "Over the course of this process, several inconsistencies have emerged between reported data and verifiable records," she said. "We will review those now." Carter felt the shift immediately, not in the room, but within the structure of the conversation. This was no longer a presentation. It was a reconstruction. Ellie did not look at him as she spoke. Her attention remained on the document. "The first category concerns financial movement through intermediary entities," she said. A page was turned, specifically transfers that align with key negotiation intervals but are not disclosed within the formal structure of this agreement. Carter's hand moved slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to indicate recognition. Ellie continued without pause. "These transactions are documented here," she said, gesturing to the page. "They have been cross-referenced with both internal and external records." Daniel spoke briefly. "Each entry has been verified for accuracy and continuity," he said. "There are no gaps in the sequence." The words were clinical, deliberate, final. Carter's mind moved quickly, searching for an angle, a response, a reframing that could reestablish ground beneath him. But every approach required a level of uncertainty that no longer existed in the material being presented. "These are standard consulting allocations," he said, finally, his voice controlled, though not as steady as before. "They fall within acceptable parameters." Ellie lifted her gaze. For the first time since the meeting had begun, she looked directly at him while responding. They would, she said, if they had been disclosed. The sentence was simple, but it removed the foundation of his argument entirely. Carter held her gaze, searching for something, an opening, a hesitation, anything that suggested this was still a negotiation. There was none. Ellie lowered her eyes back to the document. "We will move to the second category," she said. The transition was seamless, unemotional, absolute. "Communication patterns," she continued. Another set of documents appeared, arranged with the same level of precision as the first. These include internal and external correspondence that demonstrate a divergence between stated position and operational intent. Carter felt the pressure increase not through volume but through alignment. Each piece of information did not stand alone. It connected, it reinforced, it created a structure that did not require interpretation to be understood. Ellie spoke without deviation. "Internal communication suggests an awareness of limitations within the proposed structure," she said. "External communication does not reflect that awareness." She paused just briefly. Not for effect, for clarity. This discrepancy introduces risk. The word carried weight in a room like this, not moral weight, not emotional weight, operational weight. Risk was measurable, and anything measurable could be acted upon. Carter leaned forward slightly. "You're interpreting selective information," he said. "Context matters." Ellie looked at him again. "Yes," she said, "it does." Then she turned the page. "We have accounted for it." Daniel added quietly, "All correspondence has been reviewed in full context. Nothing has been isolated." Carter's response stalled before it could form, because context had been his strongest position, and it had already been removed. Ellie continued. "The final category concerns conduct," she said. There was no change in her tone, no indication that what followed carried any different weight than what had come before. But Carter felt it. Before the document was even presented. The screen at the far end of the room activated. The video appeared without introduction. Rachel's angle, the dinner, the sequence. No distortion, no omission, no ambiguity. Carter did not look at it immediately. He did not need to. He already knew what it contained. But the room watched, not with judgment, not with reaction, with attention. Ellie did not speak while the video played. She did not need to guide interpretation. The footage did that on its own. When it ended, the screen returned to black. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not uncertain, resolved. Ellie closed the folder in front of her. "All three categories are interconnected," she said. "They reflect not isolated issues, but a pattern." She looked at Carter once more. Not with accusation, not with condemnation, with finality. "This pattern is incompatible with the level of trust required for this agreement to proceed under your representation." The words were measured, but they carried consequence. Carter's hands tightened slightly against the table. "You're making a decision based on no." Ellie said, her voice still calm, but now unmistakably firm. "We are making a decision based on verified information." The correction was precise, and it removed him from the center of the process entirely. Leonard Price, who had remained silent until now, spoke for the first time. "What is Orlean's position moving forward?" he asked. Ellie shifted her attention to him. "We are open to continuing discussions," she said, "under revised representation." The meaning was clear. The deal could survive. Carter would not. The room absorbed that without reaction, because in this space, decisions were not personal. They were structural. Carter sat back slowly. There was no argument left that could reassemble what had been dismantled. Not in this room. Not with this level of alignment. Ellie gathered her documents, her movements, as precise as they had been at the beginning. There was no satisfaction in them, No sense of victory, only completion. "The meeting is concluded," Daniel said. Chairs moved. Papers were collected. The structure dissolved as efficiently as it had formed. Carter remained seated for a moment longer, not because he expected something to change, but because he understood too late that everything already had. The legal process did not unfold dramatically. There were no scenes that resembled confrontation, no raised voices echoing through hallways, no final arguments delivered with emotional intensity. What followed instead was something far more precise, far more controlled, and ultimately far more decisive than anything Carter Blake had prepared himself for. The system moved forward, and it did so without needing him. Within days of the board meeting, formal proceedings accelerated in a way that reflected both the strength of Ellie's documentation and the clarity of her legal strategy. Laura Bennett handled every communication with measured restraint, ensuring that each response was not only accurate, but positioned in a way that prevented unnecessary escalation. Every document submitted was complete. Every claim was supported. Every request aligned with established legal standards that did not require interpretation to be enforced. Carter's legal team responded as expected. They challenged the framing of the incident, attempted to reposition it as a moment of misjudgment rather than a pattern of behavior, and questioned the relevance of certain financial records within the context of the marriage. Their language was carefully designed to create space where Ellie's structure had left none. But space in this case could not be created through argument, because the foundation had already been built on verification. The protective order was granted first. It arrived as a formal notice, its language consistent with the tone that had defined the entire process, neutral, structured, and final in its implications. Carter was required to maintain distance. Communication was restricted to legal channels. Any deviation from those terms would trigger consequences that were clearly outlined and enforceable. He read the document in his office, the same place where he had first opened the petition for dissolution. This time, he did not pace. He did not call anyone immediately. He simply sat the paper resting on the desk in front of him, understanding that the system had moved beyond the point where his interpretation could influence its direction. At Hawthorne and Price, the consequences arrived with equal precision. The board did not make a public spectacle of the decision. There was no announcement framed as scandal. No formal statement that drew unnecessary attention to the internal reasoning behind it. Instead, Carter was informed that he would be stepping back from all responsibilities related to the Orline transaction, effective immediately. The phrasing was deliberate. Stepping back, not removed, not dismissed. But the distinction existed only in language. In practice, the outcome was clear. Marissa Cole assumed interim control of the deal, working directly with Leonard Price to reestablish alignment with Orline under revised conditions. The transition was efficient, executed without disruption to the broader structure of the firm. Carter was left outside of it. He remained employed, at least for the moment, but his position had shifted in a way that did not require formal acknowledgement to be understood. Meetings he had once led continued without him. Communications that had once included him arrived through filtered summaries, if they arrived at all. Control once assumed had dissolved into absence. Ellie did not attend the court proceedings in person. She did not need to. Laura Bennett represented her, fully presenting the case with the same clarity that had defined every step leading to this point. The documentation spoke for itself. The timeline held. The video, when referenced, did not need to be shown in full to carry its weight. The court did not require emotion. It required structure, and Ellie had provided it. The dissolution of the marriage progressed without unnecessary delay. Terms were negotiated within the boundaries already established by the evidence. Financial arrangements were addressed through existing records. Property division followed legal standards that neither party could reasonably contest without contradicting documentation already on file. Carter attempted at moments to reinsert himself into the process. He requested direct communication. It was denied. He proposed alternative interpretations of events. They were acknowledged, then set aside in favor of verifiable record. Each attempt followed the same pattern. Each attempt reached the same conclusion. There was nothing left to negotiate. The house once shared became a transitional space. Ellie returned only to finalize what needed to be finalized. She moved through it with the same quiet efficiency she had always carried, but now the purpose of her presence was different. There was no longer any need to maintain the appearance of continuity. No expectation of alignment, no reason to adjust her actions around Carter's routine. She packed deliberately. Not everything, only what mattered. Documents, personal items, objects that held meaning beyond their function. Everything else remained. Not as abandonment, as separation. Carter was present once during this process. He stood in the doorway of the living room as Ellie organized a set of files on the table, her movement steady, her attention focused entirely on the task in front of her. "You could have told me," he said. The statement did not carry accusation. It carried something else. Displacement. Ellie did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression remained unchanged. "I did," she said. Carter frowned slightly. When she held his gaze, every time it mattered. The answer did not provide him with the clarity he wanted. Because it was not meant to. He took a step further into the room. "This didn't have to go this way," he said. Ellie considered that for a moment. Not dismissing it, not accepting it, simply evaluating it. Once it happened, she said it did. There was no emphasis, no attempt to persuade. Just a statement aligned with everything that had followed. Carter exhaled slowly. "You're ending everything over one moment." Ellie shook her head just slightly. "No," she said. "I'm ending it because of all of them." The distinction was quiet, but it was absolute. Carter did not respond. Because there was nothing within his framework that could reassemble what had already been defined so clearly. Ellie returned to her work. The conversation ended without conclusion. Because the conclusion had already been reached elsewhere. In the weeks that followed, Ellie's life did not change dramatically from the outside. She continued her role at Oraline with the same measured focus, guiding the company through decisions that carried far greater weight than anything that had occurred within the walls of her former home. The merger discussions resumed under new representation from Hawthorne and Price, the structure adjusted to remove the variables that had previously introduced instability. The deal, in a different form, moved forward, without Carter. Ellie did not involve herself in the personal consequences that followed for him. She did not monitor his position at the firm. She did not track the gradual erosion of his professional standing as responsibilities were reassigned and influence diminished. Those outcomes existed within a system she no longer needed to engage with directly. Her role had been to establish truth, to align it with process, to allow it to operate. That had been done. The final order arrived without ceremony. It confirmed the dissolution. It established the terms. It closed the legal structure that had replaced the life she had once lived within. Ellie read it once, then placed it with the rest of her documents, where it joined the timeline. Not as an ending, but as the final confirmation of a sequence that had been building long before it was formally recognized. There was no visible reaction, no release, no triumph, only completion. She closed the folder, set it aside, and moved forward. Not away from what had happened, but beyond it. The city did not change for Ellie. It moved the same way it always had measured, indifferent structured around systems that did not pause for individual events, no matter how significant those events felt within a single life. Traffic continued to layer itself into patterns of movement and delay. Buildings held their quiet authority. Decisions were made behind glass and steel, recorded, executed, and replaced by new ones before most people noticed the shift. Ellie returned to it without announcement. There was no transition period that required acknowledgement, no visible break between what had ended and what continued. Her schedule resumed its usual rhythm, her presence within Oraline remaining exactly as it had been before, except for one difference that could not be documented or formally observed. She no longer divided herself. For years, Ellie Hart and Ellie Carter had existed as separate structures, parallel identities, maintained with precision, each one serving a purpose that the other could not fulfill without introducing risk. That separation had required discipline, restraint, and a willingness to remain unseen in spaces where recognition might have simplified things. Now that division no longer served a function. Ellie did not make a public declaration of this change. She did not alter her visibility in a way that would invite attention or reinterpretation. Instead, the shift occurred internally, reflected in decisions that no longer required her to calculate how one identity might affect the other. She attended meetings without adjusting her language to fit an absence. She moved through her professional environment without the need to maintain distance from her own name. The integration was quiet, but it was complete. At Oraline, the merger progressed under revised conditions that reflected a structure far more stable than the one Carter had attempted to construct. Hawthorne and Price, now represented by a different lead, approached the process with a level of caution that aligned more closely with Oraline's expectations. Marissa Cole handled the negotiations with precision. Her communication clear, her approach measured. She did not attempt to accelerate the process beyond what the structure could support, nor did she introduce unnecessary pressure where none was required. The difference was immediately evident. Where Carter had relied on momentum, Marissa relied on alignment. Where he had assumed control, she worked within the system. Ellie recognized it without comment. The deal moved forward. Not faster, but correctly. During one meeting, as the final terms were reviewed, Leonard Price addressed the room with the kind of restraint that had defined his presence from the beginning. "This is a stronger structure than what we had before," he said. It was not framed as a correction. It was framed as an observation. Ellie nodded once. "Stability tends to produce better outcomes," she replied. Leonard met her gaze briefly, understanding more than the words conveyed. No further discussion was needed. Outside of Oraline, Ellie's life remained intentionally contained. She relocated to a new residence that did not carry the history of the previous one, selecting a space that aligned with function rather than symbolism. The layout was simple, the design unobtrusive. It offered exactly what she required: control over her environment without unnecessary complexity. There were no gatherings, no attempts to reconstruct a social structure that had never been central to her priorities. Instead, her time outside of work was directed toward restoration. Not in a way that sought to erase what had happened, but in a way that acknowledged it without allowing it to define the entirety of her experience. The physical healing progressed as expected. The burn left a mark. It was not severe enough to alter function, but it remained visible, a thin, uneven line across her shoulder that did not fade entirely. Ellie did not conceal it when it appeared within the natural boundaries of her clothing, nor did she draw attention to it. It existed. That was enough. Carter Blake's life did not collapse in a single moment. It narrowed. At Hawthorne and Price, his position continued in a reduced capacity for a time, but the trajectory was clear. Responsibility did not return. Influence did not rebuild. The absence that had followed his removal from the Oraline deal extended into other areas of the firm, not through formal action, but through gradual exclusion. Opportunities shifted elsewhere. Meetings proceeded without him. Conversations that had once included him no longer required his presence. Eventually, the separation became official. His departure was documented in language that reflected transition rather than consequence, but within the structure of the firm, the distinction was understood. Outside of work, the effects were less structured. Without the systems that had defined his identity, Carter found himself in a space that did not respond to control in the same way. There were no negotiations to manage no variables, to adjust no outcomes that could be shaped through pressure. Only the results of decisions that had already been made. He did not attempt to contact Ellie again, not because he lacked the means, but because the systems that now governed that possibility did not allow for it. And for the first time, Carter understood what it meant to operate within a structure he could not influence. Ellie did not follow his path. She did not seek updates. She did not request information. His life as it continued existed outside of the system she had chosen to maintain. That separation was not avoidance. It was completion. Months later, in a meeting that carried none of the tension of what had preceded it, the Oraline merger reached its final stage. The documents were signed, the structure finalized, the outcome secured. There was no celebration within the room, no visible acknowledgement beyond the formal conclusion of the process. Ellie closed the final folder, her movements as precise as they had been at the beginning. "This concludes the agreement," Daniel Reeves said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Ellie nodded once. "Thank you," she replied. The meeting ended. Chairs moved. Documents were collected. The system transitioned to its next phase. That evening, Ellie returned to her apartment as she always did. The city outside continued its movement unaffected by the completion of a deal that had taken months to construct and years of experience to execute. Inside, the space remained quiet. She placed her bag down, removed her jacket, set her phone aside. There were no messages that required immediate response, no unresolved threads waiting for her attention. The structure of her life, once divided, once constrained by variables she had needed to manage carefully, now existed in a form that did not require constant adjustment. She moved to the window, looking out over the city without searching for anything in particular. For a moment, she allowed herself to be still, not because she needed to recover, but because there was nothing left that demanded motion. The past remained, not as something unresolved, not as something to revisit, but as a sequence that had reached its conclusion. Ellie turned away from the window. The room remained quiet, unchanged. And within that quiet, there was no absence, only space. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves when they happen. They do not arrive with clarity, and they rarely feel like turning points while they are unfolding. Only later, when everything has settled into place, do they reveal what they truly were. Lines that once crossed could never be redrawn. Ellie did not fight loudly. She did not argue her way toward justice or demand that anyone see what she had already understood. She built something instead, piece by piece, record by record, a structure that did not depend on belief, only on truth arranged with precision. And when that structure was complete, she did not use it to destroy. She used it to step away. There is a quiet kind of strength that does not need to prove itself in the moment. It waits. It observes. It remembers. And when the time comes, it acts without hesitation, without excess, and without leaving anything unresolved behind. If this story stayed with you, you can let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read those details more often than you might think. And if you believe that dignity, patience, and truth still matter even when no one is watching, then you already understand why stories like this continue to be told. You can stay if you'd like for the next one.